To really understand why this whole mess cut so deep, you have to know what that house was to us before the lawyers and the paperwork and the $1 loophole. My grandparents built it in the late 70s, back when interest rates were sky high and avocado green appliances were somehow considered stylish. It wasn't some grand estate. It was a modest, two-story house on a corner lot with a maple tree in the front yard and a driveway that always seemed just a little too short for all the cars that showed up on weekends. But to our family, it was the house. We didn't even use the street name. If someone said, "We're going to the house," everyone knew where that meant. My grandfather poured most of his life into that place. He worked double shifts for years, saved every overtime check, and did half the labor himself with his brothers and a couple of stubborn buddies from the factory. There are pictures of him standing in the middle of the empty frame, hands on his hips, grinning like he'd just built a castle. In a way, he had. Not because of the size, but because of what he imagined would happen inside it. He used to say, "This house is our anchor. No matter where everybody scatters, this is where we come back." And for a long time, that's exactly what we did. My cousins and I grew up treating that place like summer camp, therapy, and a second home all rolled into one. Every June, as soon as school was out, there was this unofficial migration. Suitcases in the hallway, kids sleeping on air mattresses, someone always yelling that they called the couch first. The screen door never really shut all the way. It just clapped behind you like the house was applauding whenever you ran in or out. We climbed that maple tree until the bark was permanently worn smooth in the spots where our sneakers dug in. We played tag in the backyard until the fireflies came out and somebody's mum yelled that it was time for real food. We watched thunderstorms roll across the sky from the front porch, sitting shoulder to shoulder with plastic cups of lemonade, listening to my grandfather tell the same stories about how he and my grandmother built this house with their own 4 hands. Inside, everything smelled like a mix of coffee, laundry detergent, and my grandmother's cooking. The kitchen table was always covered with something: newspaper coupons, half-finished jigsaw puzzles, a bowl of apples nobody touched because they were for the pie. If you had a problem, that's where you ended up, at that table, fingers tracing the wood grain while someone older than you quietly slid a plate in your direction and asked what was wrong. Holidays were bigger than any Hallmark movie. Thanksgiving meant folding tables stretching from the dining room into the hallway, kids packed onto one side, adults on the other, and my grandfather standing up at the head saying the same thing every year. "Look around. This house is for you. It's for all of you." Christmas was chaos. Wrapping paper everywhere. Somebody's new toy already broken. My grandmother pretending to be annoyed at the mess while secretly loving every second of it. Even the hard moments were anchored there. When somebody lost a job, they came to the house. When a marriage fell apart, they came to the house. When my great-aunt passed away, the family didn't say, "Where should we gather?" We just went there. The house was the answer before any question even finished forming. It was the place where the worst news was softened by the smell of dinner and the sound of dishes clinking in the sink. And woven through all of that, like background music, was the same promise, repeated over and over again. This house stays in the family. I heard it so many times growing up that it just became part of the air. My grandfather would say it when he came in from mowing the lawn, wiping sweat off his forehead with a handkerchief. "All this? It's not for the bank. It's not for some stranger. It's for you kids. This house stays in the family." My grandmother would say it while she folded towels on the couch, half talking to us and half to herself. "As long as I'm alive, this house isn't going anywhere. And when we're gone, you all take care of it together. Promise me." Our parents picked it up too. Anytime the adults were talking about money or bills or the way the neighborhood was changing, someone would circle back to that same line. Well, at least the house is secure. That's for the family. That's never getting sold. They'd say it like they were locking the front door with words instead of a key. As kids, we didn't argue with that. Why would we? The idea that the house could belong to anyone else felt as ridiculous as the idea that the sky could suddenly belong to someone else. It was the setting of our childhood, the background of every birthday photo, the place we measured our height on the pantry door frame. It was permanent. It was ours. When I got older, I started to notice that my grandfather wasn't just speaking in poetic, sentimental grandparent language. He was practical. He dealt in specifics. There were afternoons when I'd walk into the dining room and find him at that same table, glasses perched on the end of his nose, papers spread out around him, wills, insurance, deeds, all those grown-up documents nobody wants to think about until they absolutely have to. He'd tap a page with his pen and look up at me. "I don't want you kids fighting about this place when I'm gone," he'd say. "So everything is written down, clear, equal." Then he'd chuckle and make some joke about how lawyers charge by the comma, but he'd keep working. It mattered to him that there was a plan. I remember one conversation in particular. I was maybe in my late teens, old enough to understand that death wasn't just some distant concept. He caught me in the hallway, pulled me into the dining room, and pointed to a line on one of those documents. "See this?" he said. "When we're gone, the house is divided equally between you grandkids. Not your parents. You. You all grew up here. You know what it means." I nodded, not really grasping the weight of what he was giving us, both the gift and the responsibility. To me, it just felt like confirmation of what we'd always been told. Of course the house would stay in the family. Of course it would be shared fairly. Of course everyone would honor that. That's what families do, right? If you've ever believed something like that about your own family, you know how deep that trust runs. It becomes part of how you breathe, how you make decisions. You don't question it, because questioning it feels like accusing the people you love of being capable of worse. Back then, I had no idea how far worse could go. I just knew that my grandparents had built a house and wrapped it in a promise, and I believed every word of it. For a while, that promise actually held. My grandparents got older, the maple tree out front got taller, and we all did what people do. We grew up and scattered. College, jobs, marriages, kids. The house stayed the same even as everything around it shifted. It was like a bookmark in a story that kept moving forward without asking our permission. My grandfather was the first to go. He passed on a cold morning in late October, the kind of day where the sky looks like it's been erased and redrawn in pencil. We packed into the house the way we always had, but this time it felt wrong. Too quiet between the bursts of small talk. Too many casseroles on the counter. My grandmother moved around the kitchen like a ghost, straightening things that were already straight, opening and closing cabinets just to keep her hands busy. After the funeral, there was a lot of talk about arrangements. The adults gathered at the dining room table with folders and envelopes and that careful, hushed tone people use when they're trying not to upset an already upset person. My cousins and I hovered in doorways, no longer kids, but not quite full participants either. A few weeks later, my grandmother sat us down one by one and tried to explain what your brain doesn't really want to engage with, that there's a plan for after she's gone too. She reminded us of what my grandfather always said, how the house was meant for us, the grandkids, how he'd made sure things were written down, clear and equal. I nodded and smiled and told her not to worry about it, that she'd live to be 100. She just patted my hand and said, "You'll see. When the time comes, it's all in there." She tapped a folder on the table like it was a physical embodiment of his promise. She died 3 years later. Same house, same dining room, different kind of quiet. After the second funeral, the paperwork became real. There was a lawyer this time, someone in a dark suit with a gentle voice who walked us through the will. My parents sat on one side, my aunts and uncles on the other, and we grandkids took up the middle like neutral territory. The lawyer read out the usual things: small bequests, sentimental items, a little bit of money that would never come close to matching what my grandparents had poured into their kids over a lifetime. And then we got to the line that made my chest tighten. The house. Just like my grandfather had promised, it was left to us, the grandchildren, equally. Not to our parents, not to the family in some vague way, to us. My name was there in black and white, right alongside my cousin's, co-owner. One share of the place that had built me. There were details, of course, legal language about how decisions had to be unanimous to sell, what happened if one of us wanted out, what to do if someone couldn't afford their portion of the taxes. Somewhere in there was a line I barely registered at the time about first right of refusal, if any share was transferred outside the bloodline. It sounded technical, like something that belonged in the lawyer's mouth, not in my daily thoughts. I remember glancing up and seeing my cousins' faces as the lawyer spoke. Some looked bored, some looked overwhelmed. One of them, Lena, leaned forward, asking practical questions about utilities and maintenance. Another, Kyle, joked about how we were land barons now, and everyone laughed because it was easier than acknowledging what had actually just happened. We had inherited the heart of our family. The general agreement was simple. We would keep the house. "We'll figure it out," someone said. "We'll split the costs, take turns using it, maybe fix it up a bit." There was talk about renting it out short-term to cover property taxes, about hosting holidays there in rotation. A lot of ideas, not a lot of concrete plans, but underneath all of it was that same assumption we'd grown up with. Of course we're not selling. That's off the table. And for a while, it worked. Sort of. The first couple of years, we all tried. We chipped in what we could for repairs. Lena, who lived 20 minutes away, checked on the place more than anyone else. She'd send updates in the family group chat, a picture of the new roof after a storm, a note about the plumber fixing a pipe. Kyle, who worked in real estate, offered opinions on contractors and insurance. I lived a couple of hours away, so my contributions were more sporadic. Weekend visits, cleaning out closets, writing checks when I could. Then, real life decided to pile on. It started with my job. I'd been working for the same company for almost a decade, climbing the ladder one cautious rung at a time. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. Then one Tuesday afternoon, HR sent an email asking everyone to check their inboxes for important organizational updates. You can probably guess how that went. My organizational update was that my department was being restructured, which is corporate for evaporated. I walked out of the building with a cardboard box and a severance packet that looked more substantial than it felt. I told myself it was an opportunity, that I'd land somewhere better, that this was just a bump. Then my marriage cracked right down the middle. My ex and I had been shaky for a while. Too many arguments about money. Too many nights where we sat on opposite ends of the couch scrolling through our phones like polite strangers. Losing my job didn't create our problems, but it turned them up to full volume. Every conversation became an audit. Every small purchase turned into a referendum on responsibility. "I can't be the only adult here," he snapped one night, as if I had chosen to be laid off. I started sleeping in the guest room before either of us said the word divorce out loud. It felt like moving into a waiting room for my own life. While all that was happening, my mother's health started to slide. Doctor visits turned into specialist appointments, turned into hospital stays, turned into long phone calls with insurance companies where the hold music became a soundtrack to my anxiety. I was driving back and forth between cities, trying to be a good daughter, a halfway functional spouse, and a job seeker all at once. If you've ever had a season where everything breaks at the same time, you know the feeling. It's not just stress. It's this constant high-pitched hum in your brain that never quite shuts off. You stop opening mail because you already know it's a bill you can't pay or a notice you don't have the energy to decipher. You answer calls only if the number looks like a doctor's office or a potential employer. Everything else goes to voicemail and then stays there. Somewhere in that blur, the house slipped from the front of my mind to the very back. It wasn't that I didn't care. I did. I clung to the idea of it like a life raft. At least there's the house. At least that's solid. At least that's something my grandparents left us that nobody can take away. But day to day, the logistics of it, property taxes, maintenance, decisions about what to do with the place, started to feel like one more spinning plate I couldn't keep in the air. Lena stepped in more and more. "Don't worry about it," she'd text when I apologized for being late with my share of some repair. "I'm already over there all the time. I'll front it, and we'll settle up later." Kyle, too, made himself sound helpful. "I know you've got a lot on your plate," he'd say on the phone. "Let me deal with the contractors and the county and all that. It's basically my world anyway. I'll make sure everything's taken care of." At first, that sounded like kindness. Family stepping up when you're down, that's what it's supposed to look like, right? I remember feeling grateful, even a little guilty, like I was the one failing them by not being more present. When paperwork came in the mail about the house, things forwarded from my grandparents' old address, envelopes with county logos or bank names, I'd snap pictures and text them to Kyle. "Is this something I need to freak out about?" I'd ask. "Nah," he'd reply. "Just standard stuff. I'll handle it." Sometimes he'd ask me to sign something to keep the records updated, or to authorize him to speak to the tax office on all our behalf. It was always presented as routine, boring, necessary. I'd scroll through the pages, not really absorbing the legal language, and sign where he highlighted, because he was the one actually showing up at the county office. I was just trying to get through my days without screaming. When my ex finally did say divorce, it came out flat, like he was ordering from a menu. "I think we're done," he said, and there was no big fight, no dramatic exit, just paperwork and dividing up furniture and trying to figure out who got which holidays with a family that already felt like a cracked plate. In the middle of that, my mother's condition took another turn. There were more tests, more medications, more nights where I sat in a hospital chair pretending to nap while nurses moved quietly in and out of the room. Finding a new job became less about career growth and more about, "Please, for the love of God, just give me health insurance." I did eventually land something, but it paid less and came with a schedule that felt like a punishment. Odd hours, constant shifts, no predictability. My life shrank down to immediate crises: rent, utilities, my mum's prescriptions, my own exhaustion. The house became theoretical. When family group texts lit up about small things, someone repainting a bedroom, a broken window, a new neighbour, I'd tap a heart on the messages and tell myself I'd get more involved once things calmed down. When Lena mentioned covering the taxes, for now, I thanked her and promised I'd pay her back when I got back on my feet. I never asked too many follow-up questions. I was tired. I wanted to believe that my grandparents' plan was holding, that the adults in the room, because I no longer felt like one, were doing the right thing. If I'm being brutally honest, there was another layer to it too. Shame. I didn't want to admit to anyone in the family how bad things were for me financially, how close to the edge I felt most days. The house felt like this symbol of stability and legacy, and I felt like the opposite of that. So when my cousins sounded confident and in control, I let them take the steering wheel. I told myself that was me being practical, not weak. So there I was, newly divorced, underemployed, stretched thin between responsibilities I never planned for, running on caffeine and denial. I stopped visiting the house as much, because every time I walked through the door, I felt like I was letting my grandparents down somehow, like I should have my life more together by now. The irony, of course, is that while I was busy blaming myself for not being a better adult, other people were quietly taking full advantage of the fact that I wasn't watching closely. At the time, though, I didn't see it. To me, the house was still the one steady thing in the middle of my chaos, the promise my grandfather made, written into a will, wrapped in family, guarded by people I trusted. I had no idea that while my own life was falling apart, the foundation under that promise was cracking too, and by the time I realized it, the damage would already be done. The day I found out started out so ordinary, it almost feels insulting in hindsight. I was standing at my little kitchen counter in my one-bedroom apartment, post-divorce, post-layoff, post just about everything, sorting through a stack of mail that had been quietly accumulating on the chair by the door. You know the stack, I mean. The one you move from place to place instead of actually opening, promising yourself you'll deal with it this weekend, like there's going to be a weekend where your life magically gets lighter. Most of it was what I expected. A couple of credit card offers I had no business accepting, a medical bill in an envelope too thin to be anything good, some coupons for a grocery store I barely had time to shop at. And then there was one envelope that looked different. It was from the county. Not the town where I lived now, but the county where my grandparents' house was. The house. The return address hit me with this weird mix of comfort and dread. Anything tied to that zip code had always meant family, holidays, memories. Lately it tended to mean taxes. I almost set it aside to deal with later, but something in my gut made me slide my thumb under the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper with too much text and not enough explanation. At the top, in neat, official font, it said, "Notice of property transfer. Final record." I frowned and read it again, slower. The notice listed the parcel number, the street address of my grandparents' house, and then, in a tidy little line that made my stomach drop, it showed the transferor and the transferee. Under transferor, it said, "The estate of grandparents' names and designated co-owners." Under transferee, it listed the name of an LLC I didn't recognize. Some bland, two-word combination that sounded more like a shell company than a person. Something like Maple Corner Holdings, LLC. There was a date of transfer, a recording fee, a stamp at the bottom that said the document had been filed and accepted. And then, at the very bottom, in plain language, as if to drive the nail all the way in, there was a sentence confirming that this notice served as record that ownership had been updated in the county's system. I read that paragraph 3 times before my brain allowed the words to organize themselves into meaning. The house had been sold. I checked the date again. It wasn't last week. It wasn't yesterday. It had been months. There was no line with my name, no signature block for me as an individual. No notation that co-owner X declined to sign or co-owner unavailable. Just one flat, finished fact. The property had changed hands. For a second, my mind did that thing where it tries to protect you by offering ridiculous explanations. Maybe this is a mistake. Maybe this is some sort of clerical mix-up. Maybe they sent this to me by accident. I checked the name and address at the top. It was mine, in full. First, middle, last, correct apartment number. They hadn't sent this to the wrong person. I grabbed my phone and took a picture of the notice, then another one closer up, as if the act of documenting it might somehow undo it. The first call I made wasn't to my cousins. It was to the county office listed in the tiny print at the bottom of the page. After a polite eternity on hold, a woman picked up. Her voice was calm, practiced, the kind of tone people use when they deliver bad news all day and have learned how to sand off the edges. I gave her the parcel number, the address, my name. "I just received a notice of transfer," I said, hearing the strain in my own voice. I'm one of the co-owners listed on the original deed. I don't understand what this means." She typed something, keys clacking faintly through the line. "Well," she said, "according to our records, the property was sold to Maple Corner Holdings, LLC on," she read the date, "and the deed was recorded on that same day. All proper documentation was filed." "Right," I said, my throat tight. "But I never signed anything agreeing to sell. I never agreed to transfer my share. Are you sure you have the right person?" She paused. I could hear her shifting windows on her computer. "Your name is on the original deed, as one of the heirs," she said. "The most recent transfer lists the estate and designated representatives. It looks like the transaction was executed by authorized parties on behalf of all co-owners." "Authorized by who?" I asked. "Because it wasn't me." She hesitated just long enough for me to know that, whatever came next, I wasn't going to like it. "I can't give legal advice," she said carefully, which is what people say right before they tell you something that's going to require a lawyer. "But if you believe you didn't consent, you may want to consult with an attorney. All I can tell you is that, as far as the county is concerned, the property now belongs to the LLC listed." I thanked her, because that's what we're trained to do, even when someone is effectively telling us we've been erased from something that mattered deeply. Then I hung up and stood in the middle of my kitchen staring at the counter like the notice might rearrange itself into a different outcome if I just glared hard enough. The next thing I did was open my laptop. I typed the address into a search bar. All of a sudden, the screen filled with results that had never been there before. Real estate websites, listing histories, a tiny thumbnail picture of my grandparents' house with the maple tree out front. I clicked one of the sites, and there it was, in bright, cheerful font, "Sold." Right under that, like a punch, was the sale price. I sat down hard in the chair. The description of the property was so matter-of-fact, it felt rude. Charming, well-maintained family home, with great bones and plenty of potential. As if all those decades of birthdays and arguments and casseroles had just been staging. There were photos, the front porch, the living room, the kitchen where my grandmother used to stand and tell us to sit down and eat. Somewhere in the process of prepping it for sale, someone had stripped out half the personality, neutral paint colours, empty countertops. No sign that this had ever been a real, messy, functioning family home. And under all of that were the words: seller, private party; buyer, Maple Corner Holdings, LLC, private party. That private party was supposed to include me. My first instinct was still to rationalize, because accepting the truth felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Maybe the listing was wrong. Maybe the transfer notice was a glitch. Maybe someone had started a process and then cancelled it, and the website was just slow to update. I grabbed my phone again and scrolled to Lena's name. She picked up on the second ring, sounding out of breath. "Hey, what's up?" she asked. "Did something happen with the house?" I asked, skipping any attempt at small talk. "I just got a notice from the county about a property transfer, and I'm looking at a listing that says it's been sold." There was a pause on her end, a small, sharp silence, like the moment right before a glass slips out of someone's hand. "Oh," she said finally. "Yeah, about that." My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it. "About that?" I repeated. "Lena, what do you mean, about that? Did you sell the house?" "It wasn't just me," she said quickly. "It was all of us. Look, things have been really tight with the taxes, and the roof was going to need more work, and we were bleeding money keeping it empty. We had to make a decision." "We?" I said. "Who is we?" "Kyle and me," she said. "And some of the others. We talked about it in the group chat, remember? There were messages. We said we might have to sell if things didn't improve." I closed my eyes, trying to pull up those conversations. There had been vague comments about options and reality and not sustainable forever. But no one had ever said, plainly, "We are listing the house." No one had ever asked, "Do you agree to sell your share?" "I never agreed to that," I said, my voice starting to shake. "I never signed anything saying we could sell. I thought we were renting it, or figuring out some other arrangement." "Well, Kyle talked to the lawyer," she said, her tone shifting into that nauseating mix of defensive and patronizing. "He said there were ways to handle it, so we didn't need everyone physically in the room. You've got so much going on. We didn't want to put more on your plate. We thought—" "You thought it was better not to tell me you were selling the house," I cut in. "Not to tell me at all. Just do it?" "We didn't hide it," she insisted. "We sent documents. Kyle said he sent you emails and forms to sign." "The only things I signed were for repairs and tax stuff," I shot back. "And even that, half the time I did without fully understanding because you two told me it was routine. I never signed anything that said, 'Yes, please. Go ahead and sell the only real thing my grandparents left us.'" Lena sighed, and the sound made my skin crawl. "Look," she said, "it's done. The buyers have already started their plans. It's not like we ran off to Vegas with the money. Everyone's getting their share. You will too." There was a roaring in my ears, like someone had turned up the volume on the worst possible soundtrack. "My share," I repeated slowly. "My share of something that wasn't supposed to be sold in the first place. Do you remember what they said? Grandma and Grandpa? This house stays in the family. Do you remember that? Or were you too busy calculating the listing price?" "That's not fair," she snapped. "You haven't even been around. Kyle and I have been doing all the work, taking all the risk. You think the county cares about some sentimental promise from 30 years ago? We had to be realistic." The word realistic landed like an insult. Realistic, to me, had meant getting laid off and taking whatever job I could find to stay afloat. Realistic had meant moving into a cramped apartment and juggling my mother's medical crises with my own collapsing life. Realistic had meant trusting that the one thing I thought was solid, the house, was being watched over by people who claimed to love it as much as I did. Apparently, realistic to them meant cashing out. "I need to see the paperwork," I said finally, my voice cold. "All of it. The listing agreement, the sale contract, the deed, Whatever you signed, I want copies." "Why?" she asked, already sounding annoyed. "Are you going to sue your own family now?" "I don't know what I'm going to do," I said. "But I'm not going to sit here with a notice from the county and a Zillow page as my only explanation for why the house is gone." She muttered something about Kyle being the one who had all that stuff and said she'd tell him to send it. The call ended without a goodbye. I set the phone down and realized my hands were shaking. I looked around my tiny apartment at the mismatched furniture and the stack of bills and the grocery list I'd half written on the back of an envelope. Nothing in that room belonged to any version of the future my grandparents had imagined for me. The one thing that had was gone, sold off, signed away, reduced to a line item on a closing statement. And the people who had done it weren't strangers or faceless corporations. They were the same cousins I'd climbed trees with, the same kids who'd sat at that crowded Thanksgiving table listening to my grandfather say, "This house is for you, all of you." When betrayal comes from strangers, it hurts your pride. When it comes from family, it rearranges your sense of reality. Sitting there with that notice in front of me, I felt something inside me shift. The tired, overwhelmed part of me wanted to crawl back into the familiar excuse. "You're too exhausted to fight this. They probably did what they had to do. Just take your check and move on." But there was another part, smaller and sharper, that wouldn't shut up. It reminded me of my grandfather at that dining room table, glasses slipping down his nose, tapping a specific line in a document and saying, "Everything is written down, clear, equal." It reminded me of how he'd pointed to a clause and told me, "This way, nobody can just do what they want with the house behind everyone else's backs." At the time, I hadn't paid much attention. It had sounded like legal overkill. A belt, suspenders, and a safety harness for something that already felt secure. Now, staring at a piece of paper that said the impossible had already happened, I realized that whatever he'd put in those documents might be the only thing left standing between me and accepting this as permanent. I didn't know it yet, but buried in that stack of dense legal language was a loophole, a tiny, overlooked line that would give me a way back into a house everyone else thought they'd locked me out of for good. And the price of walking through that loophole? Exactly $1. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the front porch of the house, the way it looked in the listing photos, half emptied and staged, as if someone had taken my memories and run them through a filter called generic. At some point between 1 a.m. and whatever time the birds started yelling outside my window, I made a decision. If this was really done, like Lena said, I wanted to hear that from someone whose paycheck didn't depend on keeping my cousins comfortable. So the next morning, on my break at work, I called a lawyer. I didn't know any real estate attorneys personally. I picked a name off a list my coworker had used when she bought her house. A woman in her 40s with good reviews and a plain, no-nonsense website. I left a shaky voicemail explaining that there'd been a sale of inherited property I hadn't agreed to, and that I needed someone to tell me if I was crazy for thinking something was wrong. She called back that afternoon. "This is Claire Andrews," she said. "You left a message about a possible unauthorized sale." "Yes," I said, clutching my phone a little too hard. "I'm not even sure where to start." "That's okay," she said. "Start from the beginning. And if you have any documents, wills, deeds, the notice you received, bring them. I'll take a look, and then we'll see if there's anything there." She had an opening the following week. It felt like forever, but it was the soonest she could do. I took the appointment. In the days leading up to it, I turned into a low-budget archivist. I dug through boxes in my closet, The plastic tubs I'd stacked after moving out of my married life, the folders my mother had given me after my grandmother died. It's amazing what you can find when you stop assuming all the important stuff is someone else's responsibility. There it was. The folder with my grandparents' will. The thick packet from the first time the lawyer had gathered us to talk about the estate. A copy of the deed that listed all of us grandkids as co-owners. And, tucked into a separate envelope like a bonus track on an album, a document I didn't remember paying much attention to at the time. Family Occupancy and Transfer Agreement, it said at the top. I flipped through it quickly, eyes skimming over phrases that made me feel like I'd swallowed a handful of marbles. Family use only. Right of occupancy. Restriction on transfer outside direct descendants without written consent. Notice requirements. Right of first refusal. I felt a flicker of something that hadn't shown up in a long time. Hope. By the time I walked into Claire's office, my arms were full of paper. She sat across from me at a polished wooden desk, glasses perched on her nose, a legal pad at the ready. "Okay," she said, after we made it through the small talk required by human society. "Tell me what happened." I did. I told her about the house, my grandparents, the will, the way we'd inherited it. I told her about my job loss, the divorce, my mum's health, the way I'd leaned on Lena and Kyle to handle the day-to-day. I told her about the notice from the county, the real estate listing, the call with Lena. She listened without interrupting much, occasionally jotting something down or asking a clarifying question. When I finished, she pulled the stack of documents toward her. "Let's see what we're working with," she said. She flipped through the will first, nodding slightly. "This is pretty standard," she said. "They left the house to you grandkids equally. That lines up with what you said." Next was the deed. She read it more slowly, tracing a line with her finger. "Okay," she murmured. "Yes. Here. Each of you is listed individually as a tenant in common. No joint tenancy with rights of survivorship, so your shares are distinct. That matters." "Is that good?" I asked. "It's important," she said. "It means your interest is separate and identifiable. Harder for someone to pretend it just melted into the group." Then she picked up the extra document, the one in the separate envelope. "The Family Occupancy and Transfer Agreement," she read aloud. "I don't see one of these very often. Your grandfather was thorough." She skimmed the first page, then the second. Around page 3, her eyebrows went up. "Oh," she said. "Well, this is interesting." My heart kicked. "Interesting how?" I asked. "Good interesting or you're screwed interesting?" She gave me a quick half smile. "Potentially good," she said. "Depends on how things were handled." She turned the document around so I could see and tapped a paragraph with her pen. "Right here," she said. Section 4. Restrictions on transfer outside direct descendants. Your grandparents put a covenant on the property. That means they attached conditions to how it can be transferred, and those conditions stick to the property, not just to the people. I stared at the dense text. It still looked like word salad to me. "In regular person language?" I asked. "In regular person language," she said. "They wanted to make it very hard for anyone to sell the house outside the bloodline without everybody's knowledge and consent." She read aloud, paraphrasing as she went. "Any proposed sale or transfer of any interest in the property to a non-descendant party must first be offered to the remaining descendants at a nominal consideration of $1. She paused and looked up at me. "And written notice must be sent to each descendant at their last known address, with at least 60 days to exercise this right of first refusal." I blinked. Nominal consideration? I repeated. $1, she said. I let that sink in for a second. So, you're telling me, I said slowly, that if they wanted to sell the house to a non-family member, they had to offer it to us, individually, first, for $1. Exactly, she said, and not just offer it in a vague, we mentioned it in the group chat way. They had to send formal written notices to each of you with a clear timeline and terms. If you waived or didn't respond within the set period, then they could proceed. If you chose to exercise your right, you'd have the option to acquire the property, or the portion in question, for that nominal amount under the conditions described. I thought about my mailbox, about all the bills and junk and flyers I'd been drowning in. I'd never seen anything like that. No certified letters, no forms titled anything close to notice of proposed transfer or right of first refusal. I never got anything like that, I said. Not once. Did anyone mention this clause when you talked about the sale? She asked. No, I said. Lena just said Kyle talked to the lawyer and handled it. If this was part of the conversation, they didn't share it with me. Claire nodded slowly, her expression sharpening. Here's the thing, she said. If they sold the property to an outside entity, this LLC, without properly honouring the covenant, there's an argument that the buyer took title subject to that defect. In other words, the title might be clouded. Clouded, I repeated. Like, dirty? Not clean, she said. Problematic enough that if anyone ever looks closely, which we are doing now, they'll see there's a question mark on whether the transfer complied with the recorded restrictions. I felt a flicker of anger cut through the fog of hurt. So, what does that mean? I asked. Can we undo it? Get the house back? We need more information, she said. First, I want to see the closing documents for the sale, the purchase agreement, the deed to the LLC, any affidavits your cousins or other representatives signed. We also need proof about whether any notices were sent to you. Certified mail receipts, emails, anything. I thought about Lena's vague promise that Kyle had everything. I can ask for the paperwork, I said. He's probably not going to be thrilled. That's okay, Claire said. If they don't cooperate, we can pull most of it from the county and the title company. It just takes longer. But before we escalate, I usually like to give people a chance to hand me the shovel they've been digging with. She leaned back slightly, studying me. I'll be honest, she said. Cases involving family and inheritance get messy fast. You have to decide what you want. Are you looking for money? An apology? Or do you actually want the house back? The question hit me in the chest. Did I want money? Could I use money? Absolutely. My bank account was not subtle about its needs. But when I pictured cash in my hand versus that front porch, that maple tree, that dining room table, money felt thin. I want the house, I said. If that's even possible. That's what my grandparents meant this to be. And if they really tried to protect it with this clause thing, I don't want that to go to waste. Claire nodded once, decisively. Okay, she said. Then our goal is to leverage this agreement and your status as an heir to challenge the sale. At minimum, we can make life uncomfortable for the current owner. They may have been innocent in this. They likely trusted your cousins and the title company. But they still bought a problem. And the $1 thing? I asked. Is that symbolic, or? It can be both, she said. Legally, you don't need a large sum to make a contract binding. Nominal consideration is often used in situations like this as a way to formalize transfers within families or trusts. Your grandfather chose that number on purpose. It says, This house isn't about money. It also gives you, as a descendant, a very specific and powerful right if it's invoked correctly. I sat there, a little dizzy. My cousins knew about this, I asked. They would have seen it, right? When we first went over the documents? When they talked to their lawyer? They should have, she said. If whoever handled the closing ignored this document, or dismissed it as unimportant, then that's on them. But from a moral standpoint? She gave a small shrug. Your cousins lived in that house same as you. They heard the same speeches. They knew what your grandparents wanted. The anger sharpened into something almost clean. What do we do next? I asked. First, you formally retain me, she said, sliding a short agreement across the desk. Then we send some letters. Her plan was simple in structure, complicated in effect. Step 1. Send a demand for documents to Kyle and Lena, reminding them of the covenant and requesting complete copies of everything related to the sale. Step 2. Send a notice of claim to the LLC and the title company, informing them that a descendant with a recorded right of first refusal had not been properly notified or given the chance to exercise that right. Step 3. See who panicked first. Most investors hate uncertainty, Claire said. They don't want to own something that could turn into a lawsuit, especially if the problem is public record. This agreement is recorded alongside the deed. Anyone who looked closely would have seen it. That gives us leverage. And best case scenario? I asked. What does that look like? Best case scenario, she said, is that the buyer and your cousins realize it's cheaper and easier to unwind this than to fight about it. Maybe the buyer demands their money back from your cousins. Maybe there's some sort of settlement. But as part of that, you, as the descendant asserting your right, could negotiate to take title to the property under the original terms your grandparents laid out, including the $1 consideration. You mean, I said slowly, they sign the house over to me for $1. Potentially, she said, in exchange for you releasing your claim and clearing the title. It's not guaranteed, but your grandfather gave you a very sharp tool. It would be a shame not to at least pick it up. I stared down at the agreement on the desk, the line where I was supposed to sign my name. For most of my life, I'd been the person who didn't want to make waves, the one who smoothed things over, who tried to keep the peace, who believed that family would eventually do the right thing if you just gave them enough time. Time, apparently, had only given them space to see what they could get away with. I picked up the pen. I'm in, I said. As the ink dried on my signature, I thought about my grandfather hunched over this same kind of paperwork years ago, trying to imagine every way his intentions could be twisted, every angle someone might use to undermine what he was building. He couldn't have known exactly how it would go wrong. But he had known one thing, that words on paper matter, that promises mean more when they're backed by something enforceable. He'd left me that enforcement mechanism, like a small, quiet grenade in the file folder. Harmless if everyone did what they were supposed to, devastating if they didn't. My cousins had just given me a reason to pull the pin. When I walked out of Claire's office, the air outside felt different. The house was still technically gone. The listing still said sold. The county still showed Maple Corner Holdings, LLC, as the owner. But for the first time since I opened that notice in my kitchen, I didn't feel helpless. They had sold our inherited house behind my back. Now I had a way to reach through the fine print, grab it by the deed, and pull it back toward me. One clause, one letter, $1 at a time. The letters went out on a Tuesday. I know because Claire told me. She sent me a copy of each one by email. PDFs with calm, lethal language that made my cousins, "We thought it was best for everyone." Texts looked like doodles in crayon. One letter was addressed to Kyle and Lena, plus the other cousins who had been listed as representatives in the closing documents. Another was addressed to Maple Corner Holdings, LLC. A third went to the title company that had handled the sale. They all had the same spine. She laid out the facts: that a recorded family occupancy and transfer agreement existed, that it required formal notice and a right of first refusal to each descendant before any sale to a non-family party, that I, a named descendant and co-owner, had never received such notice and had never waived that right. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Accordingly, she wrote, "Our client hereby asserts her right of first refusal, as described in Section 4 of the agreement, and is prepared to accept transfer of the property in full satisfaction of that right for the stated nominal consideration of $1, along with assumption of ongoing tax and maintenance obligations." I read that line 3 times, my heart hammering. I am prepared to accept transfer of the property for $1. It sounded surreal, even on paper, like a dare written into the margins of a contract. The goal here, Claire had told me, is not to bluff. It's to remind everyone involved that your grandfather built a trapdoor into this situation, and they walked right over it without looking. I went back to work, answered emails, sat through meetings, forced my brain to care about spreadsheets while those letters flew off into the world like tiny paper missiles. It didn't take long for them to hit. The first call came that evening. Kyle's name lit up my phone while I was standing in my kitchen stirring a pot of pasta I barely tasted. I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then I thought about all the times I'd avoided conflict in the past and where that had gotten me. I answered. "What the hell are you doing?" he snapped, not even pretending at small talk. "I just got a lovely little letter from some attorney claiming you want to undo the sale and take the house for $1. There it was. No warm-up, no pretense, just straight to outrage. "I'm enforcing a clause our grandparents put in place," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could. "The one they recorded to make sure nobody sold the house behind anyone's back. The one you conveniently forgot to mention when you decided to cash out. That clause is ancient," he said. "It was never meant to be taken literally. Grandpa just didn't understand how property works now. The market's totally different." "If it was so meaningless," I said, "why didn't you tell the buyer about it? Why didn't the title company make sure it was handled? Why didn't you send me any formal notice giving me the chance to exercise it?" He actually scoffed. "Because we thought you had enough going on," he said. "You couldn't even keep up with your share of the taxes. You expect me to believe you had the money to buy out the rest of us. You want the buyer to believe that? Come on." I leaned against the counter, staring at the stove like it had personally offended me. "I don't have to prove I could match the market price," I said. "That's the point. That clause doesn't say, offer the family the property for whatever a developer will pay. It says, nominal consideration, $1. Grandpa wrote it that way on purpose. It was never about squeezing maximum profit out of the house. It was about keeping it where he wanted it. "You're being ridiculous," he said. "Do you have any idea how insane you sound, walking into a room full of investors and lawyers shouting, 'Give me a house for $1'? "I'm not walking into a room shouting anything," I said. My lawyer sent professional letters quoting a legally binding recorded agreement. If anyone in that closing bothered to read the documents they were working with, none of this would be a surprise. He was quiet for a second. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from angry to Something else. Tight. Worried. "You're going to blow this up for everyone," he said. "The money from the sale? It's already allocated. People have used it, paid off debts, made plans. You start pushing this, and the buyer's going to come after us. The title company's going to get involved. You're dragging the whole family into a mess." "The whole family," I repeated. "Funny. You didn't seem too concerned about the whole family when you decided to sell the one thing that actually belonged to all of us." "You're making this personal," he said. "It is personal," I said. "It's also legal. Those two things can happen at the same time." He exhaled sharply, that frustrated guy sigh that says, "You're not behaving the way I expected you to." "Is this about money?" he asked. "Is that what you want? More than your share? Because if that's it, we can talk numbers. I'm sure if you back off, we can—" "It's not about money," I cut in. "If it was, I'd be asking for a bigger check, not a house with a 30-year-old furnace and a roof that needs constant attention. I want what Grandpa and Grandma intended. I want the house. And I want to know that when someone signs my name away on a document, there's a consequence." "So you'd rather make your own cousins look like criminals," he said, "than let this go?" "If the shoe fits," I said quietly. He swore under his breath. "You're going to regret this," he said. "Once lawyers get involved, it doesn't stop. They're going to dig through everything. Do you really want that? For Mum to have to see all this? For your mum to get dragged into it while she's not even well?" The mention of my mother made my stomach tighten. There it was. The guilt card. I took a breath. "I didn't start this," I said. "You did, when you sold the house without following the rules you knew were there. If any of this spills into the wider family, that's on you." He started to say something else, but I'd reached my limit. "I'm not going to argue with you on the phone," I said. "If you have something to say, you can talk to Claire. Her number's on the letter." I hung up before he could respond and set the phone down like it might explode. The silence in my apartment felt heavier than any argument. A part of me wanted to call Claire immediately, to tell her every word he'd said, to ask her if we were really doing the right thing. Another part of me, to my surprise, a louder part, felt steady. For once, I hadn't folded at the first sign of family disapproval. I'd held a boundary and pointed someone toward the appropriate channel. The person I was paying to handle the legal fallout. Progress, in its own small way. The next call didn't come from family. It came from an unfamiliar number with an area code I recognized as the county where the house was. "This is Mark Harrison," the man on the line said when I answered. "I represent Maple Corner Holdings. We received a letter today from your attorney." His voice was smooth, professional, with just a hint of strain at the edges. "Yes," I said. "I'm aware." "I wanted to reach out," he said, "because this is the first time we've heard of any issue with the chain of title. The sellers assured us everything was in order. We did rely on a title company, and the documents they provided indicated that all co-owners had authorized the sale or were properly represented." "I didn't authorize it," I said. "And I was never properly notified, despite what that agreement requires." There was a rustle of paper on his end. "We've reviewed the family occupancy and transfer agreement your attorney referenced," he said. "It does appear to have been recorded. I'll be honest with you, Ms." He used my last name. "This is problematic." "For you," I said. "For me, it's the only thing standing between my grandparents' intentions and what my cousins decided was convenient." He cleared his throat. "I'm not calling to argue with you," he said. I'm trying to understand what you want, so we can determine whether there's a path forward that doesn't involve everyone spending the next 2 years in court. I thought about it. There were a lot of things I wanted: an apology, an acknowledgement of what had been done, my grandparents back at that dining room table, a few hundred conversations I'd never had, rewound and replayed with better choices. But in terms of what could actually happen, I want the house, I said. I want clear title in my name, as the descendant exercising the right my grandparents gave me. And I want the record to show that I didn't just sit quietly while other people treated that clause like a decorative border. He was silent for a long moment. Let's say, he said slowly, hypothetically, we were willing to unwind the transaction. That would require the sellers to refund the purchase price, cover our costs, and compensate us for the time and plans we've already put into this property. They signed representations at closing. If those turn out to be false, we will absolutely be pursuing remedies. I assume you understand that. I understand that if they lied or omitted things to get this sale through, I said, that's between you, them, and the title company. I didn't sign those representations. I didn't get a chance to be in the room. He sighed. Your grandfather was very thorough, he said. I have to admit, I've seen a lot of creative covenants in my time, but $1 right of first refusal is up there. I don't find it creative, I said. I find it comforting. Another pause. Your attorney suggested, he said, that in exchange for you releasing your claims and clearing the covenant issue, you'd be willing to accept title to the property under the original agreement for the nominal consideration specified. $1, I said. Yes, he said, sounding almost amused despite himself. $1, and you'd take on future taxes and maintenance. I would, I said, gladly. Then the question becomes, he said, whether the sellers and the title company are prepared to make that financially viable from our end. That's not something I can answer on this call, but I wanted you to know we're not ignoring this. He paused, then added more quietly. And for what it's worth, Miss C, last name, I understand why you're upset. If this had been my grandparents' house, I'd probably be sitting where you are. Something in my chest unclenched a little. Thank you, I said. Your attorney and I will be in touch, he said. In the meantime, if your relatives contact you about this, I'd strongly suggest you let counsel handle it. Family dynamics are complicated enough without legal disputes layered on top. He hung up before I could tell him he was about 3 months late with that advice. Over the next few weeks, everything became emails and updates. Claire would call or send a message. We've received the closing documents from the title company. I've found some things that are interesting. Or, Maple Corners Council has signaled they're open to a negotiated resolution, but they want assurance you'll sign a full release if we reach agreement. She found what we expected, and feared. In the closing file, there was an affidavit signed by Kyle and one of my older cousins, stating that all co-owners had been contacted, notified of the proposed sale, and either consented or failed to object within the required timeframe. They represented under oath that notice was given, Claire said. If it wasn't, that's not just a civil problem, that's potential fraud. I sat with that word. Fraud. I thought about Kyle's voice on the phone, accusing me of making everyone look like criminals. The bitter irony that he might have done that all by himself. Would they really risk that? I asked. Sign something like that without actually following the rules? People do, she said, especially when they convince themselves they're doing the practical thing and that any details they skip are just technicalities. But in law, technicalities are where cases live or die. Lena texted me a few times during that stretch. At first, it was anger. "I can't believe you're doing this," she wrote. "Kyle says the buyer is furious. You're going to bankrupt us all." Then, eventually, it shifted to panic. "You don't understand," she wrote one night. "We used the sale money to pay off the second mortgage on our house. If this all gets undone, we don't have that cash anymore. We can't just give it back." I stared at the screen for a long time before answering. "I'm sorry you're in that position," I typed. "But you put yourself there when you signed documents that said I'd been notified when I hadn't. This isn't coming out of nowhere. It's a straight line from your choices to these consequences." She didn't reply. Somewhere in the background, negotiations were happening that I wasn't invited to. Claire summarized them for me in plain language, stripping out the legal jargon. The title company realized they'd missed the covenant in their initial search, or seen it and failed to flag it as a problem. That was a big deal. It meant they had exposure. Maple Corner, understandably, was furious they'd bought into a situation with hidden complications. "Nobody wants to be the last one holding the bag," Claire said. "The buyer wants their purchase price made whole or close to it. The title company wants to limit their liability. Your cousins want this to go away. And you—" "I want the house," I said. "Right," she said. "So here's what I think is going to happen if things continue in this direction." She laid out the likely path. The buyer would agree to unwind the sale if they were reimbursed by some combination of the title company's insurance and funds your cousins could scrape together, maybe with loans of their own. In exchange, they'd deed the property to you under the original agreement, invoking your right of first refusal at the nominal $1 consideration. You'd sign releases stating you wouldn't pursue further claims against them or the title company regarding this sale. "It won't fix everything," she said. "Your relationship with your cousins will probably never look the same. They may resent you for a long time. But legally, you'll have what your grandparents wanted you to have. A house that remains in the family, under your care." I sat with that for a moment, feeling the weight of it. "How likely is this, really?" I asked. "More likely than them wanting to pay my hourly rate for the next 3 years," she said dryly. "People talk big about fighting it out in court until they see the invoices. The existence of that covenant, and the way the sale ignored it, is a strong motivator for them to settle." It was a strange feeling, knowing that a piece of paper my grandfather had signed years ago, with no idea what specific drama it would eventually be used in, was now the fulcrum on which all of this balanced. All he'd wanted was to keep the house from slipping into the hands of strangers. He probably never imagined that the strangers would be the least of the problem, that it would be his own blood who tried to sidestep the rules. As for me, I'd always thought of myself as the quiet one, the reasonable one, the person who avoided escalation at all costs. Yet here I was, half a step away from taking a whole house back with a single dollar and a clause everyone else had treated like fine print. Beat by beat, letter by letter, it was becoming real. They had sold our inherited house behind my back. Now, for the first time, the people on the other side of that sale were starting to understand something my grandparents had known all along. You can ignore a promise for a while, but if you write it down well enough, it has a way of coming back.